Hey everyone, my name is Ben Chaish, and today we're looking at two of the best cameras for wedding photography and two of the cameras that I believe in the next few years are going to be the most used and just the most popular cameras out there. And that is the new Sony A7IV and the Canon R6. Now, as always, for some background and disclaimer, Sony is lending me the A7IV as well as a 24, a 50, and a 135. I used them on a wedding that I just did in Wyoming a couple days ago. So it is definitely not a camera I've used for a long time, but I've definitely put it through a lot of different use cases in the last week or two. The Canon R6 is mine. I have purchased it with my own money, and it's been used to film almost all of these YouTube videos for a long time now. I've actually used it more as a video camera, oddly enough, than a stills camera, but I've definitely taken it to a ton of weddings. There also hasn't been a time in the 15 or so years that I have been doing photography that I haven't owned a Canon camera. So I'm very familiar with that ecosystem. So I'll probably end up talking a little bit about menus and things like that. And so know that my comfortability is definitely with the Canon system, so some of my pain points might be coming more from that than from the system itself. So just take that for what it's worth. All right, and then please excuse what I'm assuming is going to be a slight variation in color and exposure and stuff right here. I'm actually filming this video on the X100V, which obviously you don't normally do, but I'm always sort of testing something else when I'm making these videos as well for another video. So I realized the ND filter was on, which is definitely not normal to have an internal ND on a small camera. Photographers are always asking about like switching between Canon and Sony and who has better autofocus, who has better low light, who has better resolution, all this kind of stuff. So hopefully it'll at least put you on a path to figuring out which direction you should go in. And then I will also say that if you are already in the ecosystem of either Sony or Canon, both of these are phenomenal cameras, and you don't have to feel like one is so superior to the other that you should just completely jump ship back and forth between one or the other just for the camera itself. There are lots of other reasons why you may consider doing that. But I would say just from the specific camera body, for most people in the wedding photography use case at least, you are going to be more than fine with either one. And the TLDR of it is that I highly recommend either of them for wedding photography. Now let's start where I usually start, which is price. They both come in at almost exactly $2,500. I believe the Sony is, $2,498, while the Canon is $2,499. So technically, the Sony is the more budget-friendly option at $1 less. As far as autofocus goes, I feel like these two are definitely at the top of the game as of this point. They both have very good eye-tracking autofocus. I don't feel like either of them is like highly better than another one. I definitely had really good luck with both in my use case in some pretty intense scenarios. So I don't see that being an issue that you would want to choose one over the other, because both of them are really good in that regard. Now, in terms of sensors and resolution, obviously these are both full frame cameras. I did note, oddly enough, that the Sony is not a full 36 by 24 sensor. It's actually a 35.9 by 23.9. So if you want that extra 1/10 of a millimeter, Canon's your boy. But in terms of sensor, the bigger thing obviously is going to be the resolution. The Sony comes in at around 33 megapixels, which I feel like is about the sweet spot at this point. It's a little bit more than what most people need, which is probably a good thing moving forward. The Canon, on the other hand, comes in only slightly over 20 megapixels. And in my opinion, I would say that 20 is like the bare minimum. Like if you were doing wedding photography, 20 is like the least that you could get away with and feel like you're giving your clients a full modern superior product in that way. Now, in terms of low light performance, which as a wedding photographer is very important, I'll put some samples on the screen here, but I didn't feel like either of them was just like leaps and bounds better than the other or anything like that. For normal wedding photography use case that goes up to like 12,500 ISO, I feel like these perform pretty darn well. I might edit this out later after I look further at the images, but I actually found the Sony to have slightly worse high ISO performance than the Canon. Now, it's definitely not something that I use in the use case of wedding photography, but both of these cameras do have fairly high performance shutter modes. I believe the Sony A7IV comes in at 10 frames a second. So if you want to hear that, you can definitely feel it, and it sounds pretty chunky. And I believe the Canon is supposed to have 12 frames a second on mechanical shutter. It doesn't sound like it's as fast, but maybe that's just because it is a little more subtle. This is not something I would recommend putting a camera up so you get a bunch of dust in here, but we'll do it for the camera. Aw, that's crazy. And since this is a loaner, sorry Sony, we're gonna try it out with you too, but for what it's worth, I did do it on my own camera too. So let's just see what this looks like here. Okay. So, I mean, overall, I don't feel like that is a necessity for wedding photography, but at some of those more key moments, maybe like a first look or a first kiss or main things like that, when there's really something happening and you don't care about blowing through a bunch of images, could definitely be helpful. I will say that as someone who used to do sports photography for the Seahawks, one of the biggest moments in Seattle sports history, my photo would probably be slightly better because I would have lots more frames per second. But for the vast majority of people, I mean, 10 or 12 is like a ridiculous amount. And one of the things that I feel like is very, very overlooked in the modern mirrorless game is the viewfinder. As you don't have an optical viewfinder anymore, you're not looking straight through the lens in an SLR setting. The viewfinder is how you experience the camera. And I will say that neither of these are like a top of the line one. They're fine, they work. But unfortunately, I've just used some of the nicer ones now and it's kind of spoiled me. So these come in at 3.68 million dots and 3.69 million dots respectively. So not really much of a difference. And then the magnification is very slightly different. The A7IV is at 0.78 and the Canon is at 0.76. It's not like a big deal and you don't really notice it when you're using it. And the Sony's feels more electronic. It feels sharper, which can be a good thing. But it also feels a little bit more computery, a little bit more digital. But for what it's worth, that's just kind of the experience I get out of the two. Now, I know that Sony and Canon are both sort of at the top of their game as far as autofocus goes. And again, I've put these both through massive stress tests and they've both done really, really well. I think I was surprised to see on the actual spec sheet that the Canon has 1,053 phase detect points, while the Sony has 759, and then they have 425 contrast detect points. I mean, overall, they both just work really, really well. The tracking is super sticky, so if you are using the tracking section of the autofocus and you put it on something, it'll just, it tracks it really, really well. I found no issues there either way, but I did find that slightly interesting. Now, as far as video goes, which is something I haven't really been super into until recently, the Sony has an amazing picture profile with S-Cinetone and S-Log and all that kind of stuff. Looks really, really good. The main kind of thing out of that is a downside is going to be that 4K 60 has a crop. For some people, that's going to be a big deal. For some people, it's not going to be a big deal. I will also say that the reports and everything like that of the camera overheating a lot, I have not experienced. I say overheating, and then my Fujifilm X-E4, which is like my overhead camera for this, overheats the moment I say that, which is really funny. The Sony A7IV and the Canon R6, neither of them in just regular 4K 24, 10-bit, 422, all that stuff, neither of them have overheated for me. I will say that the only time I've had any overheating issue on the Canon is when I've done a ton of B-roll over and over and over at 4K 60. So maybe if you were going to be doing a wedding or something like that and you were just going to lean into 4K 60 all day, it might end up being an issue, but I haven't extensively tested that. When I've just kind of bounced back and forth between 24 and 60, I haven't had any overheating issues, but that's just kind of what we get out of there. Now, this is going to be personal preference, and I know that people are going to get mad about this overall, especially because the Sony A7IV has a new menu system, but the Canon menu system is just so much easier and so much more straightforward. I know that I am more used to it because I've been in that ecosystem for much longer and everything. I technically do tech reviews on YouTube and camera reviews specifically, but as someone that in the last calendar year has used every menu system from Canon and Sony and Fujifilm and Leica and Hasselblad over multiple cameras, I just find the Sonys to be the most confusing. Normally, I would sort of chalk it up to the fact that there's just so many more custom functions and everything. And while there are, when you look at the bodies, they're not that much different overall from each other in terms of custom functions. So it's definitely just an interesting thing in that way. Now that we're talking about the body as well, one of the things I want to talk about is just the overall feel of the camera. The Sony A7IV just feels better and feels more, I don't know, substantial. I kind of do like the angular feel, and while it may or may not show up on here, there's kind of a cool little texture going on. I feel like the grip is very, very just robust. It feels just more like a solid camera in that way. While the Canon R6 just feels a little bit more like it's trying to go for more of a sleek feel. Obviously, you've got lots of rounded things, and the spot where your finger goes on the front isn't as intense. The grip itself has less texture. The top has a texture, but it's not the same as the Sony. So I feel like you're almost going for a more kind of elegant look. The buttons even feel kind of softer and stuff. So it kind of goes with the ecosystem a little bit, because the Sony feels a little bit more computery, a little bit more utilitarian, while the Canon feels a little bit more organic-y, a little bit more soft and subtle. I feel like it makes sense in the ecosystem of the menus and the overall experience as well. It's definitely kind of where I'm pulling this from. Now, if you're a hybrid photographer, videographer, and you're switching between both often, I feel like a huge pain point on the R6 is the fact that I shoot most things in manual, and then you have to switch all the way over to the other side to get to the video setting. And then you only have one video setting. You have these 3 custom functions, but you can't use them for video. You can only use the video for video. So if you want to switch between 4K 24 to 4K 60 and kind of bounce back and forth with things like that, it's just not an easy thing to do. Where the Sony, I much, much, much prefer the system where you have this dial underneath the main dial, where you just switch right here between photo and video mode. The nice thing is you have your, PASM normal modes here, but then you also have these custom functions, 1, 2, and 3, which are available in video on this side if you have video enabled. And then they're also available separately in photo. So if you want to set up different record modes and whatnot, you can have that set on the Sony, which just makes the use of the camera, at least in video, a lot easier. If you're sticking with just one mode and you're sticking on a tripod and doing talking head stuff, totally fine with the R6. But if you're bouncing around on things and switching formats and whatnot, I found the Sony to be a lot better in that way. So overall, these are both phenomenal cameras. And while I may have nitpicked on things a little bit, I don't really see an issue with either of these being anybody's primary camera. If anybody came to me and said, hey Benj, do you recommend the Canon R6? Absolutely, great camera. Unless you need the higher resolution, go for it. Benj, do you recommend the Sony A7IV? Absolutely, it's great. And if you were already in that system, absolutely jump from the Sony A7III to the A7IV. I think it's a great buy. And if I'm being honest, if I'm playing a which is better, which would I rather have game, and I wasn't invested in either system and I was starting from scratch, I probably would go with the Sony A7IV. I think overall from a features standpoint, it is technically a superior camera because of the resolution, especially when you get into the video stuff. I feel like the usability of switching back and forth is just better on the Sony A7IV than it is on the R6. But again, if you are already in one ecosystem or another and you're just considering it and saying like, hey, is this a good camera to buy? Both of them are phenomenal and you would be going in a good direction either way. So thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions about these. I do have to send this back this afternoon. So after I make a couple videos with it, I'm putting it in the mail and we'll hopefully be able to use it at some point again. So thanks to Sony for sending this over. And then I'm not sure which order I'm going to post these, but I'm definitely going to do a review separately on the A7IV specifically. And I actually realized I haven't done a specific review on the Canon R6 as well, so that one will be coming too. And if you want to learn more about kind of my picks for wedding photography, I made specific videos about building a Sony kit and a Canon kit, which you can find in these videos right here. Subscribe right here if you haven't already, and you can support me on Patreon here, and I will see you all on the next one.